on, guys? Welcome back. And today I'm going to be talking about the last MCU movie that I'll be talking about for a while now. And I'm going to be talking about Captain America Civil War. Now, at the time in 2016, this was considered one of, if not the best MCU film. And I'm here to share my opinion, my personal opinion. I think it's a good film, and I have to give credit to this film because this is the first film that got me back into the Marvel Cinematic Universe and superhero movies in general. Because I got out of superhero movies for a long time, and this was the film that got me back into it after like 3 or 4 years of not really caring about these franchises. So I have to give this film credit for that. And I saw it at the end of 2016, almost 3 years ago, and it was a great film at the time. But now that we have more films like preceding it, I don't think it's a great film anymore, and I think that it's a lot more flawed than we give it credit for. But go. I will talk about what I like about it. It's excellently directed. A lot of the action and stunt work is in camera, and it's like there's some CG that doesn't look too good. Like Black Panther's suit doesn't look very good in some shots, and any time in the airport battle when Tony or Rhodey are on screen in their suits, it looks really fake. But other than that, I think this is the best Spider-Man suit we've seen visually in any of the films, because in Far From Home and Homecoming, they cover up the suits with CG, and it looks a little odd. In this film, I think a lot of it isn't, and Tom Holland did a lot of his stunts in this scene, in the airport scene, and I think it is noticeable, and it's probably the best-looking suit, in terms of looking real, that we've gotten so far. So there's that. It's excellently directed. Like, it subtly sets up some things, like when they're taking them to the prison. Like they're taking Steve, Sam, and Bucky and T'Challa to the prison, and it just shows a guy in a truck, and he's kind of mad because it's holding up traffic. But then later you find out that that is the guy who Zemo sent to take the package to this one guy, and he intercepted the whole order. So that's really interesting, and it's a very interesting subtle way to set up that later thing. The acting is also great, and the actors really, you can tell, and in all these films, for the most part, you can tell that the actors really cared about these films, and they cared about what they were making, and what they were doing. But I think that, other than that, those are the greatest films, the greatest things I think this film has going for it. Let's talk about Spider-Man. Tom Holland is obviously the greatest Peter Parker yet, and this was in his introductory film into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and his introductory scene is one of the best scenes, including Spider-Man, I've ever seen on film, and one of the best scenes in the MCU, and the best, if not the best scene in this film. His whole thing, he tells Tony, obviously, I think subtly hinting at Uncle Ben, saying, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you. It's beautiful in representing the character of Spider-Man, that whole scene, and in its messaging, and that's why this film, I feel now, does not have much of a soul, and it feels empty. But the reason why I love that scene so much is because Tom Holland and that whole sequence has a soul, and you can tell that they cared about making that scene. And that whole scene has a soul that a lot of the rest of the film I don't think has in that degree. So that's wonderful. Other than that, the acting, visuals, that Spider-Man scene, this film is kind of messy, and it's like, people criticize Spider-Man 3 for having kind of wonky pacing. This movie has a similar pace. It kind of gets other plotlines out of the way and then moves on. Like, Peggy dies, Steve finds out over text, and then like, in the next scene, we're introduced to Black Panther, and he's talking to his dad, and his dad says to him, for someone who's not a fan of politics, you're getting quite good at it. And it's supposed to be this sweet moment, and it is. But it's sweet in the context of having seen Black Panther, which came out 2 years after this. In this film, we've just met this character, so the emotion of that doesn't really hit us until later in the film and in Black Panther, because we don't know this character yet, we just met him. And it's an odd way to place that. So the film, I think, has a similar structuring problem to Spider-Man 3. Maybe not as bad, but it doesn't know what it wants to be. It has an identity crisis. Does it want to be a follow-up to Winter Soldier, which it tries to be in the opening with Brock Rumlow? And I feel bad for the Brock Rumlow character, because they could have set up an interesting conflict between him and Steve, and they did at the end of Winter Soldier. But in this one, it's just a few lines, and then he dies to set up the plot, which is really frustrating for me, because I feel like that character was wasted. I've said that in the past. I feel like Brock Rumlow as a character was wasted to a exponential degree, and I think that he could have been a much better character. But whatever. I also don't like the character of Sharon Carter either. I don't hate the actress or the character or the idea of the character. It's just the execution where they set up a theme for Steve where he's come back in this time where he doesn't belong, and in the end, he has to move on. And that's what he says in Endgame. We have to move on to the people, but he doesn't actually want to move on. And they set up that arc for him, but then in Endgame, he just goes back to Peggy anyway. Past the scene when he kisses Sharon in this movie, which honestly just makes me cringe now. I'm like, why did you do that, Steve? Past that scene, she leaves. She leaves the whole franchise. She never returns in this film or in the future. And it's so abrupt. It's like, okay, so the whole character was pointless. Tell me in the comments anything that she does that is necessary to the plot of Winter Soldier or this film that any other character could have done. Let me know. I think that character was pretty badly executed, in my opinion. Let me know if you agree. But every time she comes on screen, I'm like, just leave. Like, you're not a necessary character at all. So that character just kind of annoys me quite a bit. And yeah, so other than that, the film as a whole is a solid film. It is the whole package. It's got great acting, all the superhero action you want, and there's some emotional depth. And the whole setup towards the end with, Tony finding out, because they set up this whole thing where you think it's going to be a huge boss battle at the end with these Winter Soldiers, but then by the end of it, it was all just a setup. And I feel like they kind of set up Zemo to be a more interesting character than just the type of character that's like, my family died. And by the end of it, he's just like, my family died anyway. It's like, you lost someone. No. So the character's gonna be different. I lost everyone. Oh, okay. You're just one of the cliche villains where you lost people, It's even Steve is like that. He's like, you lost someone, let me guess. It's like I like that character, but it's like, and then he just tells Black Panther. I like the story arc with Black Panther in this movie, but if you skip this movie, they basically recap the whole thing of his father dying in Black Panther in the first few minutes of that film. So you can skip this film, and that's the problem. I think this film has the whole package, and it's ingeniously set up the whole final conflict where you think it's going to be a big boss battle, and then in the end, it's a much smaller, intimate conflict between Steve and Tony and Bucky, by Bucky killing his parents. It's a very well set up conflict, but by the end of it, the film doesn't matter anymore. And that's the problem. Is I think the worst thing about this film to me is the way that future films treat it, and it's that the future films just kind of ignore this film, and don't really treat it with enough respect. Because I'm going to be talking about Endgame now. Endgame doesn't give this enough time, and because you have that great moment at the beginning of the film where Tony gets mad at Steve. He's like, no trust, and it's a great scene. But then later he just comes back and he's like, here's your shield back. Let's go time travel. And it's just rushed past, and it just feels really rushed. And I know that Endgame had a lot of plots to deal with, but this is one of the biggest plots in the Marvel universe, and the whole team splits apart, but then in the end, they just come back together, and I see people saying that as a good thing, where they're like, I was sad at the end, but I knew it was all going to turn out okay. No, that's not a good thing, because by the end of it, you know that everything's going to be fine, and the stakes of this film are undone by future films, and this is a problem with Winter Soldier, that it sets up these consequences of, S.H.I.E.L.D. being destroyed, and then in the future films like Age of Ultron, S.H.I.E.L.D. is basically still around, just to a different degree. And that's one of the problems with this film is its stakes are undone. It's like, okay, what are the stakes of the airport battle? Rhodey loses his legs, but then in future films, they make it look like he's stumbling at the end. But then in future films, he's just fine. Like, he walks around on his own, he's fine. Like, he has no trouble in future. It's like, yeah, you have such great technology that doesn't matter. So the whole airport scene is... The Marvel Universe is great at crafting these films where they can have these huge fanfare action scenes, like the final battle of Endgame is... The whole last hour of Endgame, or 45 minutes, is basically just a huge, like, elongated action scene. But it all works, because that whole scene is basically a huge payoff for, like, all these movies. But with this film, it just feels oddly placed. Like, they put the teams together, and then they're like, okay, let's go fight. And then they just fight, and Steve is like, Tony, listen to me. And he's like, no. And then they fight, and then he's trying to tell Tony the truth. He's saying, Zemo, the psychiatrist, he's behind this. And Tony's like, no. And then literally the next scene after the battle, he looks at a hologram, and then he's like, oh, okay, I was wrong. That guy is behind all this. Better go help him. And it's like, okay, so that whole scene, all it was is to be like, ooh, cool. And, it is a cool sequence, and it's great action, and the people behind it clearly had a lot of passion for the whole sequence. But the consequences of it don't matter. There's no consequences for Rhodey. There's nothing. And Rhodey, he has a little bit of development in Infinity War, a minuscule amount. But past that, in Endgame, I was looking forward to see what they would do with him. He doesn't do anything. In the future films past this point, he's just a guy who hangs around. And I think he could have died. And I'm not saying that that consequences in these films have to be people dying. But he could have died, and that could have been a real stake those could have been real stakes for Tony's character. Because it could have been like, okay, Tony didn't listen to Steve, and he finds out that he was wrong, and by not listening to Steve and just having a civil agreement, they had a battle, and Rhodey died, and in the end, it's kind of Tony's fault. That would have been very interesting, but instead, it's just, like, let me know, do you think that would have been a more interesting conflict setup? Because then Tony, in the finale, not just his parents, he would also have had his friend just die, so then he would have been even more unstable in the final fight. If you see what I mean. Like, I don't really know what to say about that. And then also it's like, okay, the Avengers, they're locked up. That's a consequence. No, Steve just rescues them, and that's fine. But then it's like, in Infinity War, it's like, okay, they've been on the run for 3 years. And then they just tell you, they're like, oh, hey, we've been on the run for 3 years. And they never, like, actually, like, show you that. And I doubt we'll ever see it. So it's just like, we've had, like, almost 2 years since this film came out. And it's just like, oh, we've been on the run for a while. And they make jokes about it, how there was, like, they weren't exactly 5-star hotels or something. And it's like, okay, great, but that doesn't matter. And they also set up an interesting arc with Bucky. I think Black Panther's arc is one of the best in the film. He says, he starts up by wanting to kill Bucky, and then by the end of the film, he is going to protect him. And that's really interesting, but then it's like, okay, Bucky makes the decision for himself that he's going to go under again so that he doesn't hurt people any longer. But at the end of Black Panther, they just basically very quickly established the fact that Bucky is healed now. Shuri healed him. So now he's useless. All he is a guy with a metal arm and a gun, and he shoots people. Like, Sam is the Captain America, and I'm perfectly fine with Sam being Captain America now. But Bucky, he's so useless now. Like, the character had an interesting arc set up, and then they just basically complete that arc. And there was an interesting scene, he says to Steve at the end, Black Panther, T'Challa, he says, your friend and my father were both victims, and if I can help one of them achieve peace, that's what I'll do. And in Infinity War, there's a blooper reel where it shows, like, a goat, like, making some noise in the background, distracting the actors, but he says, you have found something, a sense of peace. And I think that was a deleted scene from Infinity War where he talks to Bucky about how he achieved his sense of peace. And that would have been very interesting instead of Bucky just being a guy with a gun. But in Infinity War and Endgame, he's just a guy with a gun who shoots people. And now he's just a useless character. And it's really unfortunate. And in the end, that's what this film is to me. It's an unfortunate case of, it's a well-made film, and I don't think it's aged poorly. There are some effects that haven't aged well. And it hasn't aged poorly at all. But it's not... It doesn't really work anymore, because these future films, basically ignored it as being important. So they're just like, okay, you know, whatever, we're friends again, here's your shield back, let's go. And it doesn't really seem like this film matters. And if you skipped it, I hear a lot of my friends saying, I never saw that one. And it doesn't really matter, honestly. Like, the film is inconsequential. It doesn't have any lasting stakes. You skip this, you don't really miss much of the story for Steve or anybody. Because they don't, no one except for Black Panther really gets any character development. All it is a setup for a huge action scene in the middle, which doesn't even matter and doesn't need to be there because, like I say, other films have an action scene as a payoff or a well set up, like a well integrated. In this film, it's not well integrated. It's just like there, and it's like in the next scene, Tony finds out he was wrong and he helps Steve anyway. So all it was is just an elongated action scene where people can go, ooh, ah, you know, it's a well integrated, or no, it's not. It's a well made film, and it was a good film at the time, and I think it is still a good film, but I think that it suffers from future films not treating it with enough respect, and for being as good a film as it was at the time, the conflicts and stakes this film had don't matter anymore, and if you skip it, you don't miss anything, really. So, I know this may be surprising to you, but I'm gonna give Civil War, like I say, there's some great acting, some great action, but the action isn't very well integrated. Spider-Man there's some great character arcs. Spider-Man has a great introductory scene. Black Panther has a great arc. And it's all good. Like, the whole setup for the finale is all good, but it's all undone. None of it matters anymore. So Civil War, I think, isn't a bad film. I know I've been ranting about it, but I just wanted to say that I think it's an unfortunate case of future films not treating this one with enough respect or, you know, caring enough to really keep this film having any lasting impressions on people. And, like, when I watched it, I was like, okay, yeah, this is great, and I've watched it a few times. But while I'm watching it, I just feel empty. Like, now that these future films have filled all these things up, all of it just feels empty to me. Like, the emotions at the time were felt, but they aren't anymore. This film just makes me feel so empty. Like, when I'm watching the action scene, the airport scene, I'm having fun, and I'm like, this is fun, this is exciting, but it's nothing. Like, it makes me feel so empty, and this film has, like, no soul. Like, it does have a soul, but at this point in time now, it doesn't have a soul anymore. It just doesn't matter anymore. And it makes me kind of sad to say, but like, so I guess wrapping it up, this will be the last MCU film I talk about for a while now. I just want to take a break from reviewing them. I'll do Lego videos and stuff, but I'm not taking any requests for MCU reviews anymore. So Civil War, I think it's a good film, but has not been treated with enough respect from future films. Let me know, what do you think of my opinion? I know I really, like, dug deep into it in this video, but, yeah, just please let me know, what are your opinions on Civil War? Do you agree with me? Do you not agree with me? Whatever your thoughts are, let me know in the comments below, and I'm gonna give this film, like, a C+ or a B-, somewhere around that range. And, yeah, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.